What's up, everyone? Hope you're all doing well, staying safe. This episode is going to be on everything that happened to me during my first hospital stay. And before I start, if you guys can subscribe to my channel and hit the like button, that'll really help me out. Thank you. Before I get to the video, I have something that I need to say. A few months ago, right after I started doing these videos, I was talking with my cousin who also fought and beat cancer. And we were talking about how we're going to come together and share our stories with the hope of helping anybody going through what we did, or just to help as many people as we could. Sadly, this past December, she passed away, and it wasn't from the cancer. She beat that like a gracious badass. This was something else. So going forward, this video and whatever else I do with the channel, whatever happens with the channel, is going to be dedicated to her memory. For me, getting chemo wasn't like what you see on TV or in movies. I didn't go to an infusion center with other patients. Everything was done with me staying in the hospital. And the reason for that was because of the way the chemo worked. My blood levels were already really low from the leukemia, and then the chemo kind of acted like hitting a reset button on my bone marrow. It wiped everything out, the cancer cells, the healthy cells, everything. And then once my bone marrow started back up and started making healthy cells only, that's when I was considered to be in remission. The entire process of getting chemo, having it work in the body, wiping everything out, and then all my blood levels coming back to safe range takes about 30 days. And until that happens, I had to stay in the hospital. So during this time, I needed a lot of blood transfusions. Every morning, my nurse would come in and draw my blood just to check my levels for the day. And then if I needed blood, they would order from the blood bank. The normal range for your hemoglobin or your red blood cells is between 14 and 18. For your platelets, it's between 130 and 400. They would order blood when my hemoglobin was at 7 and my platelets were at 10. The blood that they would give me wasn't normal blood either. It had to be specially treated. First of all, they had to make sure that the blood they were giving was compatible with my blood type, and then it had to be irradiated, CMV negative, and leukoreduced. Irradiated means that the blood was treated with radiation to minimize any transfusion GVHD. CMV is a pretty common virus that is basically harmless to most people, but for somebody in my condition, it can be very dangerous. So they had to make sure that the blood didn't have any of that. And then leukoreduced basically means that they take the white blood cells out of the final blood product. They don't transfuse white blood cells because that's where all of the viruses and all of the bacteria are. And it can be really dangerous to transfuse that, and there's no real benefit, so they just don't do it. Your neutrophils make up about 40% of your white blood cells, and they kind of act like the first line of defense whenever you get sick. So your neutrophil level is a pretty good indicator on how strong your immune system is. Normal level is between about 1.7 and 7. Anything below 1.5, you're considered to be neutropenic, which basically means your immune system isn't as strong as it should be. After the chemo set in and wiped everything out, my neutrophil count was at 0. So I basically had no immune system. And when your levels are that low, it's extremely easy to get an infection. And once you do get an infection, without antibiotics, you can't fight it off. For the first 2 weeks, there were more days when I had a fever than days without it. I actually had a pretty bad reaction to one of the antibiotics that they gave me. It's called red man syndrome, and everything from my chest up turned red, and it looks and feels like really bad sunburn. And then on top of that, I had a pretty high fever, like I think 102 or something like that. Looking back, one of the hardest things I had to do was accepting how weak I had become. This was actually around the time when I fainted for the first time. I don't remember why, but my nurse asked me to stand up. So I made my way to the edge of the bed. And then before I could stand up all the way, I was out. Thankfully, she was there and she grabbed me by one arm, and my dad was there, grabbed me by the other arm, and they kind of pulled me back down on the bed. Before I got sick, I was a full-time student, had a part-time job, had an internship, hung out with friends. I did basically everything a normal 19-year-old would do. And after I got sick, I couldn't do anything on my own anymore. I think one of the worst things for me was definitely taking showers. Now, obviously, it's really important to shower every day, especially for someone like me, when any bacteria on my skin could potentially lead to an infection, but I hated it. Right before I was going to shower, my nurse would come in and hook me from the IV line, and then they would wrap my arm up with a small trash bag and tape it off, so somewhere from here to here, just to cover the PICC line, and they would seal it off pretty tight to make sure that there was no water that got into the line, because even a little bit of water in that area can lead to an infection, and then that just that's a whole other issue. But they would wrap it so tight that I can barely move my arm. And then I was so weak that I actually couldn't stand in the shower. They had to bring a chair for me. And I was kind of hesitant to use it at first because I'm 19 years old. I'm a man. I don't really need the help in the shower. But then whenever you realize that I was so weak that I couldn't even make it from my bed to the bathroom without being completely out of breath and feeling like I'm about to faint, it kind of made sense for me to use the chair. And it also hit me that if I, God forbid, I was to fall in the shower, then that would make everything a million times worse. And then since my arm was wrapped up, I couldn't really move it, so I kind of needed help while I was in the shower, and just trying to wash myself in the shower was pretty exhausting. I was out of breath almost every time. The one good thing about showering was that was the only time when I wasn't hooked up to the IV. Most of my medications were through the IV, and even whenever I wasn't getting chemo or any meds, I was still hooked up just getting IV fluids. Anytime my nurse would access my IV line, whether it was for a blood draw or for medication, they would have to flush it out just to clean out the line. And it doesn't matter where the IV was in your body, whenever they would flush it with the saline, it feels like somebody was squirting a water gun in the back of your throat, and you automatically get the taste like you just swallowed salt water. Thankfully, that only lasts for like the first 200 or 300 times. After that, you get used to it. All of the meds through the IV were hooked up to this pump, and anytime there was something wrong with the line, the most obnoxious alarm would go off. And it would go off for everything. Sometimes I was just in bed trying to turn around, or other times whenever I was taking a shit and I would have to throw the line over my back so it doesn't hit the floor. Imagine listening to that 24/7. I swear, the damn thing has a sensor built into it that knows when you're trying to sleep. Every time I was trying to sleep, it would just go off. And after a while, it almost became like a regular alarm. The second it would go off, I would just like in my sleep kind of reach the mute button until it shuts off and until my nurse comes in to fix it.
For 5 minutes. Could you not be yourself? For 5 minutes!
It was always freezing in the hospital, and anytime you looked at my mom, she looked like she was dressed to climb Everest. And it was pretty funny because outside, this was happening in July, so outside it's probably like 85, 90 degrees. And then you look at my mom and she has like 2 sweaters and 3 jackets on her at all times. Every night when she would go to bed, she would wrap herself up with 3 or 4 of these really thick blankets, and all you would see was a small hole in the top of her face just so she can see and breathe out of. She basically looked like a giant dolma. I remember this one time that she was worried that she was going to get sick and catch a cold, and if she did, then she wouldn't be able to take care of me. So she got one of those vitamin C packets that you dissolve in water just to kind of give her a boost. I've heard that when people are pregnant, they have a really heightened sense of smell. Now, I don't know if this is true. I haven't been pregnant yet. But the second that she opened that bag, it almost felt like I was. As soon as she opened that bag, I got this disgusting citrus smell in my nose, and it was instant nausea. I wanted to tell her to get the fuck out of the room, but before I can even do that, I just threw up all over the place. And it wasn't just that one time with that vitamin C thing. It was anytime my nurses would try to bring me food. I can smell the food from the hallway, and I wouldn't even let them bring it in the room, because the second they bring it into the room, I knew I was going to throw up. For the first 2 weeks, I was pretty sedated. I was on a lot of morphine, and it wasn't until one of my nurses told my doctor that I shouldn't be asleep most of the day that they kind of lowered my dose to the point where I was a little bit more awake. Because I was neutropenic, they put me on something called neutropenic precautions. And when it came to food, that meant that I couldn't have any fresh fruit or raw vegetables. Everything had to be thoroughly cooked, and even the water couldn't be spring water. It had to be purified. It really didn't matter a whole lot though, because even on a good day, all I would have to eat was maybe half of a saltine cracker and like a sip or 2 of water. But it wasn't that bad because I didn't have an appetite. It's not like I was starving and I didn't eat anything. I didn't feel hungry, so there was really no need for the food. I probably should have waited a little bit longer to eat my first piece of real food. I don't know whether it was from the medication or the chemo, but it was the most disgusting slice of pizza I've ever had in my life. And after I finished eating it, I had the worst heartburn and instant nausea. So my nurse gave me something called a GI cocktail. It's this drink that you kind of drink to settle your stomach and to soothe your nausea. It didn't work. I still threw up after that. So, what happens when you combine chemo drugs plus medication for sleep, anxiety, breakthrough pain, and an ungodly amount of morphine? You get some really fucked up dreams. Now, I've had so many of these over the last 5-6 years, but there's one that I remember very vividly. It was during the night after I had that disgusting slice of pizza. And if you can imagine kind of like a flat plane of land with these really tall, thin black towers coming out of the ground, And then there were these small tree houses on top of the towers that were connected by like a drawbridge, kind of like what you see on Return of the Jedi when they're on Endor. Yeah, I know, I'm a huge Star Wars nerd. I was in one of those buildings or one of those tree houses, and then I was getting chased by this weird hybrid of an animal that had a human face, body of a monkey, and wings of a bat. And as they were chasing me, they were spitting the fucking GI cocktail that I had after the pizza. And then I tripped in my dream. And when I woke up, I threw up again after that. It was about 10 or 15 days after we started chemo that I finally started losing my hair. And I hadn't shaved or gotten a haircut for a good while before I went to the hospital. So at this point, I kind of looked like the Geico caveman. Once my hair started falling off, it didn't fall off all at the same time. It kind of fell off in like bits and pieces, but it kept getting everywhere. Like anytime I was gonna sleep, it would end up on the pillow. Or whenever I was in the shower and I was washing my hair, it would just end up all over my hands. We couldn't shave it off either because my platelets were still too low, and at that level, I was at a pretty high risk of bleeding, so they couldn't take that chance. They had to wait, I think, till my platelets were like at 15 or 20 before they finally let me shave. My hair was falling off to the point that you can literally just pull it right off my head. And if you've ever eaten cotton candy, that feeling you get whenever you pull a piece of the candy out of the big bunch, that's exactly what it felt like when you were pulling the hair out.
How to shave like a cancer patient.
And it wasn't just the hair on the top of my head, it was all over my body. Let me tell you, it's the cleanest, most painless Brazilian wax you'll ever get in your life. You just pull, bald.
1, 2, 3.
Oh, you fucker!
There wasn't a whole lot that happened in the last week in the hospital. At this point, my blood levels were coming back up, so all of my fevers were subsiding, and we were just waiting for my blood levels to come up to a point where I can go back home. I think it was a few days before I finally went home that my doctor came back in and did another biopsy just to see what the results were. And thankfully, it turns out that I was in remission, so the treatment worked the first time out. Whenever I was getting ready to leave, I put on normal clothes for the first time since I got into the hospital. And it was the weirdest feeling looking in the mirror because half of my body was gone and I was wearing the same clothes that I came in with. So whenever I came in, I was at 292 pounds. And now as I was getting ready to leave, I was down to 250. So just seeing myself in the mirror, it was surreal. Like I couldn't believe how much weight I had lost. Altogether, I spent 35 days in the hospital. Whenever it was finally time to leave, my nurse took me outside in a wheelchair. And even before we made it outside, I was able to feel the wind coming through the door. And feeling fresh air for the first time in well over a month was such a good feeling. Then finally got outside, and then we waited for my dad to bring up the car. And then once he did, got in the car and finally went home after spending all of July in the hospital.